So, Dr. Japonica, let's talk a little bit about the rational self.
Yes.
How would you break that down for someone who does not know what that means and they've never heard about that?
Well, I like to talk about, I call that part of me Brainell. So that's the part of us that like things to make sense, the logical part or analytical part, and we all have that. Some of us use that part of us more than others, but we want the world to make sense. You know, we tend to have in our DNA a drive for purpose and success. So being able to understand why we do what we do, the world in which we live, that's the part of us that wants to make pretty much rational decisions to be able to live life in such a way that is purposeful, that is connected. It just paints a bigger picture of who we are as a person, but just being able to understand, that's the biggest part. Because when we don't understand, we feel like we've lost control, right? So for me, and for a lot of people, like my rational part of myself loves education because I want to understand the world in which I live. But typically it's the analytical part, the part that common sense. Yeah, what makes sense to us. Yeah, definitely that part.
So, Dr. Japonica, you talked to us about the three main components of our personality being the ego, the rational self, and the spiritual self. So when we think about the rational self, this is the part of us that wants to understand, to connect the dots, and to overthink sometimes, correct?
That part of us can overthink.
Okay.
Certainly if we spend more energy in that part of us. So we've heard of people that's very intellectual. So that means they spend a lot of time in their rational self.
Okay.
They spend a lot of time wanting to connect the dots and make it to cause it to make sense, not only for them, but to cause it to make sense for other people. Those are typically like our, professors or researchers, people that have jobs like that. So they spend a lot of time connecting the dots, trying to make sense of probably a problem or issue so they can present it in such a way that people can move forward.
Oh, that's good. So these sound like the problem solvers of the world.
Yes,
and like you said, researchers, they're going to pull it together and find some cures and solutions and things that we may not be aware of, right?
They're going to make sense of whatever the problem is.
But then when does it become too much? When are we taking it too far? We're overthinking and now we're making assumptions for other people. What do you feel about that?
Well, that's just the key word, is making assumptions for other people.
Okay.
That's where a very analytical person would get in trouble, is making the assumptions for other people. Like it's just strictly research. Then in that type of setting, you can make these assumptions and give them to someone that can look in and say, okay, do we release this information or not? But in relationships on everyday life, that can cause a lot of problems because we're thinking that the other person is thinking like us.
Okay.
Right. So if I analyze and then I come up with this assumption and say, this is what it means to me, I got to understand that the other person may not be looking at it from those lenses. They may be more in their spiritual self or their ego self and not in their rational self. Because some people, life don't have to make sense to them all the time. They have an easier time letting go of a situation when it doesn't make sense. But then there are people like myself, probably 75% of the time, I want life to make sense.
Okay.
And it's not as easy for me to let go of a problem until I come up with a solution. How can I connect the dots to this? So, and I get in trouble. I get in trouble when I don't know how to shift gears, depending on the relationship, is I have to be consciously thinking about, okay, this is where you stand, but this other person's perspective may be completely different. So I'll ask questions to make sure that I don't succumb to assumption.
So you touched on a good point. If we find ourselves overthinking and we're going a bit too far, we need to be careful not to make an assumption, but to ask the question or ask more questions. So let's say we are in relationship with someone, it's a family member, and they do something that offends us or hurts our feelings. We may go into our mind and ask ourselves, now, why would they do that? Or why would they say that if they know that's a sore spot for me?
Yes.
Or why does this always come up at Thanksgiving dinner if they know this is an issue for me and it never turns out right? What's your advice to that person if they're in their mind? To me, it's like they're not making it up. If it's a pattern, how should they address that? And where do we draw the line so we're not overthinking?
Well, a couple things. When we're in a relationship with someone else, it's really the basic of it is understanding who you are first.
Okay.
Okay, this is my position. This is how I think, and not make it that the other person should be thinking that way.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if that other person is open to the whole idea of perspective, I have my perspective, she has her perspective, then, and we're willing to come together and collaborate and make it look like us.
No, we're not talking about that family member. I'm talking about the family member that is always maybe just assuming they're right, making comments, not thinking about the impact of their comments, and you really want to get into a healthy space with them, and you're trying to figure out in your mind, why does this keep happening? Are you saying we need to be direct in asking the question?
Sure. Certainly, to say, hey, I call it, I give people at least 3 times because
Okay.
I know that everyone does not think like me. So maybe I'm coming across wrong. Maybe I'm hearing it wrong, so I can make a lot of assumptions, especially if I'm trying to figure it out, which is one of my key words when it comes to the rational self, is I'm trying to figure it out.
Okay.
So I'll go and I'll ask the questions. I used to just assume and take offense and move forward or move away from the relationship. But now I'll go, okay, so maybe we need to talk, and maybe personality is a big issue, which, it usually is. And we assume that we're going to get along with everybody, which is not the case, even when it comes to family members. But I'll go to them and I'll say, hey, it's hurt my feelings, and I want to know, I just want to understand your perspective, because I use words like that, on how can we change this. So every Thanksgiving we get together, I've noticed a pattern in me, not make it about
that's good.
blaming them.
Wait, that's good. So when you say, I've heard a couple of things. So I'm hurt. This hurt my feelings. This is how I've perceived it.
Yes.
And this is what I would like to do. You've not pointed the finger at them once, but you've also called out that this happens every Thanksgiving. So in a way, it is putting some accountability on the fact that this does keep happening. We're not saying it's anyone's fault, but we pretty much want this to stop.
Say, my perception is that every Thanksgiving we get together, this is what happens, and I want to know how can we change it so it's beneficial for the both of us.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
And if they're not open to that and they brush it off, then I'll approach it a second time from a different perspective.
What would that different perspective be?
I would definitely say, okay, so we approached it from this, and this is an internal conversation. As I learned that person, especially if it's a relative, okay, they understand verbiage like this.
Okay.
And I'll take that verbiage and I'll go to them with that verbiage, still not pointing the finger, but saying, how can we, based on their language, because everybody has their own language. Everybody has their own perception. Yeah, everybody has their own language.
Should we ever come into the conversation and ask, have I done something to make you feel uncomfortable? Am I creating this situation for you? Should we ever walk into those difficult conversations asking and being willing to take accountability and ownership if we have played a role we're not aware of?
Definitely.
Seems like that might break some walls down a lot faster.
And just, verbiage, words have a lot of power. It just depends on the person that you're talking to, what words you want to use. So going into the situation and saying, of course it depends on the situation and the person, is to go in and just create an environment, number one, where you're not causing a person to stand up in defense. Because that's the first natural egotistical response, is when we make it their fault, then a defense wall is going to go up. But if we go in and saying, hey, this is my discomfort, and I want to know how can we do something different to change it, or what's your perspective? Because a lot of us as humans, we want to understand, we want to be understood, we want to be heard. So words like, what's your perspective on this? Yeah, wow. That just causes the defense wall to come down, and then you get their perspective. They may not even see it as an offense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so once you get each perspective on the table, then you can decide from there together if you're going to be willing to change it. That's the biggest thing. But if the person is not willing to change it, then what I usually do, and what I usually encourage my clients to do, okay, back up, approach it from a different perspective, use different wordings. Yeah, use different words, because words create. Mm-hmm. That's primarily how we eat, is we eat words. And so I tell them, go a second time, use different words that's a little softer, words that's going to create an environment for peace, and then see what they have to say. Invite their perspective, invite how they feel, invite and put it all on the table and see what the response is. Yeah.
I love that, because in a nutshell, instead of taking our rational self and overthinking and internalizing and trying to connect the dots, you've taken it external and empowered us to ask the questions, to have the difficult conversations, which don't necessarily mean it has to be a negative conversation.
Exactly.
A difficult conversation may just require courage and vulnerability, but it doesn't mean that it has to be negative if we're conscious of the words we choose.
The words have a lot to do with it. I know with one of my clients, and we were talking about his wife approached him a certain way, and he told me his response, and I said, so, which caused a defense. And it said, so maybe you should consider approaching it from this perspective. And he said, wow, I didn't think about that. And so a resolution was created just based on approaching it from a different perspective. But it came from a place of blame.
But you know what I get? Because when we're looking at the rational self, you started off sharing with us the rational self wants to make everything make sense.
Yes.
But when we get out of our head, what I'm hearing is, let's focus more on the outcome that we're seeking. Let's focus on the solution. Let's focus on, do we want to come together in this relationship? If so, then we start with that intention, right? And we're not trying to figure it out inside. We're saying, let's come together with the other party.
Well, if we include other people, especially if we know we're in our heads, if we include other people, okay, so this is only one perspective. Let me ask, in order for me to connect the dots, I will need another perspective on this situation, because maybe they're not seeing it the same way I am. So when we invite that perspective, of course, being very conscious about the words, right? Because typically in relationships, when we're unconscious, we go in human nature, the ego, will go in with blame. They make it about the other person's fault and not taking responsibility for their own behavior. So that's the first thing, is getting out of a vein of blaming the other person, where you made me, so words like that, you made me feel,
right,
instead of I took the offense.
Today's segment has been brought to you by our sponsors, The Essence of Excellence, ACT Score Booster, and MarriagesCanWin.com. Be sure to subscribe to Tierra Destiny and Friends via YouTube and enter your email address at TierraDestinyRead.com for more updates, free online training, and details on our next live taping.